He zipped the duffel bag with one sharp motion and straightened, waiting. I stayed seated at the kitchen table. My hands rested around my teacup, still warm. The steam curled upward in thin ribbons, and I watched it, not him. The silence stretched between us like something physical, something he expected me to break. I didn't. Gerald adjusted the strap on his shoulder, cleared his throat once, then twice. He wanted shock, he wanted tears, pleading, perhaps the trembling question of, "Where are you going?" or "Please don't leave me." 32 years together, and he still believed I needed him more than air. I took a sip of tea, Earl Grey, the good kind I kept for myself in the back of the cupboard behind the generic brands he preferred. "That's it?" he said finally, his voice pitched higher than usual. "That's all you have to say?" I set the cup down carefully, the porcelain meeting the saucer with a soft click. The sound was deliberate, measured. Everything I did in those moments was deliberate. I had been practicing for years without quite realizing it, this version of myself who could sit still while the man I had built 3 decades around walked away as if I were a piece of furniture he no longer found useful. "Safe travels," I said. His face darkened. This was not the script he had prepared for. Gerald had always been a man who needed an audience for his grand gestures, and I had spent so many years providing exactly that, gasping at the right moments, soothing his ego, apologizing for things I hadn't done. But sitting there in my chair, with my tea and my silence, I was rewriting the ending he thought he controlled. "I'm serious, Maureen," he said, taking a step toward the door, then stopping. "I'm leaving. I heard you the first time." The late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the worn edges of the linoleum floor I had been meaning to replace for 5 years. Gerald hated that floor. He said it made the house look cheap, but he had never offered to pay for new tile. He had never offered to pay for much of anything. He shifted his weight, the duffel sliding down his arm. "You think I'm bluffing? I thought no such thing." I knew he was leaving because I had watched him pack 2 days ago when he thought I was at the grocery store. I had seen him transfer his better shirts, the cologne I bought him last Christmas that he claimed made his neck itch, and the framed photo of his mother into the bag. He had been so careful, so theatrical even in private, and I had stood in the hallway holding my breath while he practiced his exit. But I didn't tell him any of this. Instead, I lifted my teacup again, cradling it between my palms. The warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me. "I think," I said slowly, letting each word carry its full weight, "that you'll do what you need to do, Gerald, just as I will." His expression flickered, confusion, then irritation, then something that might have been fear. He wasn't used to this version of me, the version that didn't crumble. "Don't expect me to come back begging," he said. "I won't." He stood there another moment, his hand on the doorknob, and I could see him calculating whether to push harder, to manufacture a bigger scene. but I had already turned my attention back to the window, to the way the light caught the dust motes in the air, each one suspended and weightless. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Not a slam, he didn't have the courage for that, but a closing nonetheless, final. I sat in the stillness that followed. The house creaked once, settling into itself the way old houses do. My teacup was nearly empty now, just a dark ring at the bottom. I studied that ring, the pattern it made, like something you'd see in a fortune-teller's reading. But I didn't need anyone to read my future. I had been writing it myself for longer than Gerald knew. I finished the last sip of tea, lukewarm now, and rose from my chair. My knees protested slightly. Arthritis, the doctor had said, manageable. But I steadied myself against the table's edge and moved toward the sink. I rinsed the cup under cool water, watching the remaining tea swirl down the drain in amber spirals. Then I walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one Gerald never touched because it was cluttered with my things. I opened the second drawer and withdrew a thin manila folder. It was worn at the edges from being handled, reviewed, updated over the course of years. Inside were documents he had never seen. Documents he would have laughed at if he had, but he wasn't laughing now. I spread the papers across the desk, bank statements showing an account in my name only, the house deed with my signature alone, insurance policies he didn't know existed, everything I would need. I had been preparing for this moment for 7 years, ever since the night he told me I was lucky he stayed. Lucky. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should. Paper shouldn't weigh much, but these particular pages carried 7 years of quiet decisions, of late nights calculating numbers after Gerald fell asleep watching television in the recliner that had long since moulded itself to his shape. I hadn't always been the kind of woman who kept secrets. When we met, I was 41, recently divorced, working as an office manager for a small law firm. Gerald was charming then, or what passed for charming in my exhausted state. He remembered to ask how my day went. He laughed at my jokes. He suggested we split the dinner check our first 3 dates, which I found refreshingly modern, though later I realized it was simply who he was, a man who calculated fairness down to the penny when it suited him. We moved in together after a year. His apartment lease was ending and my house had an extra bedroom. It seemed practical, easy. That was the word he used most often in those early years, easy. I was easy to be with, easy to talk to, easy to love. I didn't realize until much later that what he meant was convenient. I didn't make demands. I didn't expect grand gestures. I existed in the margins of his life and called it partnership. The shift happened gradually. So gradually, I almost didn't notice. First, it was small suggestions about the house. The living room would look better if we moved the couch. That lamp was dated. Did I really need so many books on the shelves? when we could use the space for his sports memorabilia, I accommodated because it seemed like compromise, like what people in healthy relationships do. Then came the comments about money. I made decent money at the law firm, enough to cover my mortgage and expenses, with some left over. Gerald worked in sales, which meant his income fluctuated wildly. Some months were good, most were not. He began asking to borrow money, $20 here, $50 there, always temporary, always paid back eventually, though the eventually stretched longer each time. 5 years into living together, he suggested he be added to my bank account. For convenience, he said, in case of emergencies, in case something happened to me and he needed to access funds. I hesitated, some deep instinct whispering caution, but he framed it as trust. Don't you trust me, Maureen, after all these years? I added him to the account. That's when things changed in earnest. Purchases appeared on the statements I didn't recognize. When I asked, he grew defensive. I'm contributing to the household, he'd say, even though the charges were often for restaurants I'd never eaten at. Electronics, he claimed, were for us, but that only he used. Once I found a charge for a weekend at a casino 4 hours away. He said it was a work trip. I started keeping a mental list. Not consciously at first, but the way you catalogue small betrayals until they form a pattern too obvious to ignore. The time he told his friends I was terrible with money when I had been managing fine before he arrived. The way he'd sigh heavily whenever I bought something for myself, a new sweater, a book, a container of the expensive hand cream that didn't make my eczema flare, while simultaneously spending hundreds on golf equipment he used twice. The comment he made at a dinner party, laughing, saying, Maureen would fall apart without me. Can't even figure out how to reset the router. I could reset the router. I had set up the entire home network. But correcting him in front of others felt petty, so I smiled and let his version of me stand. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I had been at the law firm for 12 years by then. I was good at my job, organised, efficient, diplomatic when handling difficult clients. When the senior partner retired, there was talk of promoting me to office administrator. More responsibility, yes, but also a significant raise. Enough to finally replace the kitchen floor, maybe take a vacation somewhere other than Gerald's family reunion. Gerald found out before I could tell him. He came home that evening with a bottle of cheap champagne and a too bright smile. Heard about your promotion, he said, popping the cork without asking if I wanted to celebrate. That's great, Maureen, really great. But his voice had a flatness to it, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. We drank the champagne, or rather, he drank most of it, and then he said, almost casually, so, with that extra money coming in, I was thinking it's probably time we put my name on the house. You know, make things official. I set my glass down slowly. Official how? Well, we've been together 16 years. Common law and all that, I should be on the deed. Just makes sense. It didn't make sense. The house was mine. I had bought it 7 years before we met, had spent 15 years paying down the mortgage. His name on the deed meant he had claim to half the value if we ever separated. It meant I could lose the one thing that had always been mine. I need to think about it, I said. His face changed. The charm evaporated, replaced by something cold and angular. Think about what? Whether you trust me? Jesus, Maureen, after everything I've done for you, everything he'd done. I wanted to laugh or scream, but instead I stood and carried our empty glasses to the sink. Behind me, I could hear him pacing, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "You're being selfish," he said. "You know that, right? Selfish and paranoid." I didn't respond. I washed the glasses carefully, dried them, put them away in the cabinet. When I turned around, he was standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. "I'm not asking for much," he said. "Just what I'm owed." Owed. That word rattled around in my head for days afterward. Owed, as if his presence in my life, his occupation of my space, his consumption of my resources, entitled him to ownership. As if I were a debt to be collected rather than a person. I didn't add his name to the deed. Instead, I opened a new bank account at a different bank. I had the statements sent to my office. Every 2 weeks, when my paycheck came, I transferred a portion to that account. Not enough that he'd notice the difference, but enough that over time it accumulated into something solid, something mine. I updated my will, removing him as beneficiary and naming my niece Beth instead. I made copies of every important document, the deed, the insurance policies, my investment accounts, and kept them in a safety deposit box he didn't know existed. I stopped arguing when he criticized me. I stopped defending myself when he rewrote history in front of others. I became smaller and quieter, and he thought it meant he was winning. But I wasn't disappearing, I was preparing. Gerald had been gone 3 days when his son appeared at my door. Troy, 42 years old, divorced twice, working some middle management job he'd described to me exactly once with a kind of aggressive vagueness that suggested he didn't actually do much managing. He looked like his father, same slope to the shoulders, same way of standing that took up more space than necessary. He even had Gerald's smile, the one that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Maureen," he said, and I could hear the practiced sympathy in his voice. "Can we talk?" I didn't invite him in, but he took a step forward anyway. And I found myself moving aside because 32 years of accommodating Gerald's orbit had trained me to make room. Old habits. He settled onto my couch without waiting for permission, spreading his arms across the back in a gesture of ownership. I remained standing. "Dad's pretty torn up," Troy began, which was interesting because Gerald had left by choice and with what appeared to be considerable premeditation. He didn't want to go, you know, but he felt like he had no choice. I said nothing. In my experience, people who claim they had no choice usually mean they didn't like their options. Troy shifted, the leather creaking beneath him. That couch had been mine before Gerald moved in. I had picked it out myself, second-hand from an estate sale, and spent 2 weekends reconditioning the leather. Gerald had always complained it was too firm. "Look," Troy continued when I didn't fill the silence, "I know things were tense between you two, but he's my dad, and he's been here a long time. This is his home too." "No," I said quietly, "it isn't." His eyebrows rose. "Come on, Maureen. 32 years, that's got to count for something legally. You can't just kick him out." I could, actually. I had checked with the lawyer whose office I'd managed for 12 years. Common law marriage in our state required intention to be married, which Gerald had studiously avoided. The house was solely in my name, purchased before we met. He had no legal claim to any of it. But I didn't explain this to Troy. I didn't owe him an explanation. "Why are you here?" I asked instead. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and I recognized the posture. It was Gerald's negotiation stance, the one he used when he wanted to appear reasonable while pushing for something unreasonable. "I think we both know Dad's not great with money," Troy said, as if this were an endearing quirk rather than a decades-long pattern of financial irresponsibility. "And he's getting older. He needs security. This house, well, it makes sense for you to sell it, split the proceeds. That way you both start fresh." There it was. They wanted my house. Not Gerald deserves half, but you should sell. Because Troy knew, even if he pretended otherwise, that Gerald had no legal right to anything. So instead they were reframing it as a gift I should want to give. A generous, mature decision. The right thing to do. I thought about the grocery store. It had been maybe 2 years ago, a Saturday afternoon. I was comparing prices on coffee, the store brand, versus the one Gerald liked that cost $3 more per can, when I heard his voice from the next aisle over. He was talking to someone, his tone jovial in the way it got when he was performing for an audience. "My girlfriend still buys the cheap stuff," he was saying, and I heard male laughter in response. "After all these years, you'd think she'd learn to splurge a little, but no, she's always pinching pennies." I stood there, frozen, holding both cans of coffee. Girlfriend, not partner, not the woman he'd been living with for nearly 30 years. And the implication that I was cheap, that I was the problem, when he was the one who never contributed fairly to household expenses. I put both cans back on the shelf and walked to a different store. That night, I made coffee from the generic brand I'd bought elsewhere, and when Gerald complained it tasted burnt, I said nothing. I just poured my own cup and drank it slowly, tasting nothing but the beginning of something that might have been resolve. Now, looking at his son sitting on my couch, I felt that same resolve settle more firmly into place. "I'm not selling," I said. Troy's expression hardened. "Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. This is my house. I'm staying in it. You're being selfish. The same word Gerald had used. Probably the same word they'd practiced together, working out this strategy. Come to Maureen's house, pressure her, make her feel guilty until she gives us what we want. I'd like you to leave now, I said. He stood slowly, making a show of it, as if his disappointment in me was a weight he had to bear. At the door he paused and turned back. He really loved you, you know, Troy said, and I thought that might actually be true in his way. Gerald had loved me the way you love something useful, the way you love a reliable car or a comfortable chair. I know, I said, and closed the door. Afterward, I made myself tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the same chair where I'd sat while Gerald left, and I held the cup between my palms, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. The house was quiet. Not the hollow quiet of loneliness, but something else. Something that might eventually feel like peace. I thought about Troy's words. Security, split the proceeds, start fresh. But I had already started fresh years ago, the moment I opened that separate bank account, the moment I put documents in a safety deposit box, the moment I stopped explaining myself. I finished my tea and washed the cup, watching the water swirl down the drain in patterns that meant nothing and everything. The phone call came Tuesday morning. A chipper voice informed me that my cruise reservation for February was confirmed, and did I want to add the beverage package? I stood in my kitchen, receiver pressed to my ear, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I didn't book a cruise, I said. A pause. Typing sounds. Is this Maureen Hartley? Yes. Then according to our records, you booked a 7-day Caribbean cruise departing February 14th. Was this not you? It was not me, but I knew exactly who it was. I asked for the booking details. The reservation had been made 3 weeks ago using the credit card from our joint account, the account I hadn't closed yet because I was slowly, methodically extracting myself from every shared financial tie. The cruise was for 2 people. The billing address was mine. The total cost was $3,800. Gerald had planned a vacation for himself and whoever he was seeing now, using money from an account we both had access to. And he'd probably thought I wouldn't notice until after the charge cleared and the money was gone. I'd like to cancel, I said, my voice steady, despite the fury building beneath my ribs. There's a cancellation fee, I understand. Please cancel it. I lost $400, but I prevented him from spending $3,800 of what was largely my money. The woman on the phone processed the cancellation with professional efficiency, probably thinking I was just another retiree changing her mind about a winter getaway. When I hung up, I stood very still. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I had imagined that real anger would manifest physically, trembling perhaps, or tears, or the urge to throw something. But I felt calm, clear. The way you feel when a decision that's been hovering becomes suddenly, irrevocably solid. I walked to the living room desk and opened the drawer. The manila folder was still there, but I withdrew something else this time. A leather portfolio I'd kept, buried beneath old tax returns. Inside was a list I'd been maintaining for 5 years. Every bank account, every investment, every policy, every asset. And next to each item, notes in my careful handwriting about what needed to be done to separate my life from Gerald's completely. Most of the items were already checked off, but not all. I picked up the phone again. This time I dialed from memory the number for Whitmore and Associates, the law firm where I'd worked before retiring. Sarah Whitmore answered on the second ring. "Maureen," she said, warmth in her voice. "It's been too long. How are you?" We exchanged pleasantries briefly. Sarah asked about my retirement, and I told her I was adjusting. Then I told her why I was calling. "I need to update my will," I said, "and I need to make sure my estate is protected." Sarah's tone shifted, becoming more focused. "Is this about Gerald?" "He left," I said simply, "and I want to ensure he has no claim to anything I've built." "Come in Thursday," she said. "Bring everything, account statements, the house deed, insurance policies. We'll make sure it's airtight." Thursday, 2 days away. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat down with my leather portfolio and began making a new list. Not things to protect, but things to reclaim. The house locks would need changing. I'd call a locksmith tomorrow. The joint checking account would be closed as soon as I transferred my remaining balance. The garage still held boxes of his things, tools he'd barely used, sporting equipment collecting dust. I'd donate them. And the bedroom, the side of the bed where he'd slept for 32 years. I'd need new sheets, new pillows, something that didn't hold the imprint of him. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended state. I went through my routines, morning coffee, afternoon walk, evening reading, but beneath it all, I could feel something building. Not anxiety exactly, anticipation maybe. The sense that I was standing on the edge of something that would change the shape of my life permanently. Thursday arrived cool and overcast. I dressed carefully, a navy blazer I'd bought for myself the previous year, tailored trousers, the silver necklace that had been my grandmother's. I looked professional, composed, like someone who made decisions and followed through. Sarah's office was in a converted Victorian downtown, the kind of building with crown moulding and large windows that let in sheets of natural light. She greeted me in the foyer, and I was struck by how much she'd aged since I'd last seen her. More grey in her hair, fine lines around her eyes, and then realised I must look different too. We were both women in our 70s now, though I didn't always feel it until I caught sight of my reflection unexpectedly. We sat in her conference room, and I spread my documents across the mahogany table. Sarah reviewed each one methodically, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. "You've done excellent work protecting yourself," she said finally. "The house is solely in your name. Your retirement accounts list your niece as beneficiary." You have a separate bank account he never accessed. She looked up at me. But you want to go further. I want him removed entirely, I said, from my will, from any claim to my estate. I want it documented that he has no right to anything. Sarah nodded slowly. We can do that. We'll draft a new will, explicitly excluding him. We'll also prepare a property declaration affirming sole ownership of your house and other assets. If he ever tried to make a claim, he won't, I said. He doesn't have grounds, but I want it clear. Then we'll make it clear. We spent 2 hours going through every detail. Sarah asked careful questions about our relationship history, about whether we'd ever discussed marriage, about any documentation he might have that could support a claim. I answered everything honestly, and with each answer, I felt lighter. As if speaking these truths aloud in a legal setting gave them weight, made them real in a way they hadn't been when they existed only in my head. At the end, Sarah slid a draft document across the table. "Review this," she said. "Make sure it captures everything you want. We'll finalize it next week, get it notarized, and file copies appropriately." I read through the pages slowly. My name appeared again and again. Maureen Hartley, sole owner, sole beneficiary, sole decision maker. Gerald's name appeared exactly twice. Once to identify him as a former partner with no claim, and once to explicitly exclude him from any inheritance. "It's perfect," I said. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd seen this situation before, probably many times. "You're doing the right thing," she said, "and for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." I hadn't expected that. Pride. As if setting boundaries and protecting what was mine was something to be proud of, rather than something to be ashamed of. For so long, Gerald had made me feel that any assertion of myself was selfishness. But Sarah's words reminded me that self-preservation wasn't a character flaw, it was survival. He came back on Saturday. I saw his car pull into the driveway through the living room window, that old Buick with the dent in the rear bumper he'd gotten 3 years ago. He sat behind the wheel for almost a minute, and I wondered what he was thinking, whether he was rehearsing his lines, whether he believed this visit would go differently than Troy's. I didn't go to the door. Eventually he climbed out, carrying a folder of his own. This one was newer than mine, manila with crisp edges. He walked up the path slowly, and I noticed his limp was more pronounced than I remembered. His knee, the one he claimed gave him trouble, though he never saw a doctor about it. He used that limp sometimes, I realized, as a kind of punctuation to his complaints. The doorbell rang. I waited, let him ring again. When I finally opened the door, he had his hand raised to ring a 3rd time. We stood looking at each other across the threshold, and I thought how strange it was that a man could live in your space for 32 years and still look like a stranger when circumstances changed. "Maureen," he said, "we need to talk." About what? He shifted, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. He'd expected warmth, maybe, or at least the habitual courtesy that had characterized most of our interactions. Instead, I gave him nothing. "Can I come in?" "No." His jaw tightened. "I live here. You left. I'm coming back." "No," I said again. "You're not." He opened his folder, pulling out papers with an efficiency that suggested he'd practiced this moment. "Look, I've been thinking. We should make this official. I talked to someone, and they said after 32 years, common law provisions apply. So I had papers drawn up. It's just a formality, really. Puts my name on the house, makes it legal." He held the papers out to me like an offering, like I should be grateful he was willing to formalize his theft. I didn't take them. "Those papers mean nothing," I said. "We're not common law married. We never represented ourselves as married, and this house is mine." His expression darkened. "Don't be ridiculous, Maureen. I've been here for decades. I've contributed." "You've contributed what, exactly?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften it. "You've paid for groceries occasionally. You've covered utilities when your sales were good. But I've paid the mortgage. I've maintained the house. I've covered the property taxes, the insurance, the repairs. You've lived here." "That's not the same as contributing." "I can't believe you're being like this," he said, and there was something almost genuinely wounded in his voice, as if he truly couldn't understand why I wasn't complying after everything we've been through together. "What we've been through," I said slowly, "is you taking advantage of me for 32 years. While I convinced myself it was partnership, he took a step forward, I took a step back and put my hand on the door. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You're going to regret this. You'll be alone." "Is that what you want? To be some bitter old woman alone in this house?" There it was, the threat that wasn't quite a threat. The implication that loneliness was worse than being used, that I should be grateful for his presence, even if his presence diminished me. But I had been alone for years, I realized. Alone in a house with another person. Alone in a relationship where I did all the emotional labor. Alone in every way that mattered. Being alone without him would be different. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what I want." I closed the door. He knocked. Then he pounded. Then he shouted something I couldn't quite hear through the wood, something about lawyers and rights, and how I'd be sorry. I stood on the other side, my hand still on the doorknob, and waited for him to finish. Eventually, the noise stopped. I heard his footsteps retreating, the car door slamming, the engine starting. I watched through the window as he backed out of the driveway too fast, the rear of his Buick fishtailing slightly before he corrected. Then he was gone. I walked back to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table. My hands were steady. The afternoon light came through the window at that particular angle it only achieved in late autumn, turning everything slightly golden. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the refrigerator humming, the house settling around me. For the first time in years, the sounds didn't feel empty. They felt like present, like the house was breathing on its own terms without having to accommodate someone else's rhythm. I finished my tea and went to the garage. His things were still there, just as I'd known they would be. Boxes of tools, golf clubs, the fishing equipment he'd used maybe 5 times in 3 decades. A weight bench he'd insisted on buying that had become a place to drape towels. I found empty cardboard boxes in the corner and began packing methodically. I didn't agonize over each item. I didn't wonder whether he'd want this back or need that. I simply packed it all, everything that was his, everything that carried his presence, everything that reminded me of the years I'd spent accommodating his existence in my space. It took 3 hours. When I was finished, 12 boxes sat stacked by the garage door. I labelled each one in black marker, Gerald. Then I called a donation centre and arranged a pickup for Monday. I didn't ask him if he wanted any of it. It wasn't mine to keep, but it also wasn't my responsibility to store. The locksmith arrived Monday morning at 9. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with calloused hands and a professional courtesy that felt reassuring. He walked through my house assessing each entrance, front door, back door, the door from the garage, and gave me recommendations in straightforward language without condescension. "These locks are original to the house," he said, examining the tarnished brass of the front door. "They're 40 years old at least. Anyone with basic skills could pick them." "Replace them," I said. He quoted me a price that would have made Gerald complain about unnecessary expenses. I agreed immediately. It took him 3 hours to complete the work. I watched from the kitchen, drinking coffee I'd made strong enough to taste like armour. With each lock removed and replaced, I felt something shift. The old brass cylinders, worn smooth by decades of hands, piled on my counter like shed skin. The new ones gleamed silver and contemporary, and came with keys on rings I slipped into my pocket. 4 keys. 1 set for each entrance, mine alone. When the locksmith left, I tested each door twice. Locked, unlocked, locked again. The mechanisms engaged with a solid click that had weight to it, finality. Gerald's copies of the old keys were worthless now. Even if he still had them somewhere in that Buick, they opened nothing. Tuesday, the security company came. 2 technicians arrived in a van marked with the company logo. I'd chosen them after researching online for an hour, reading reviews, comparing monitoring services. They installed cameras above the front door and back door, and a doorbell camera that recorded motion. "You'll get alerts on your phone," the technician explained, showing me the app. "Anytime someone approaches, you'll see them before you answer." I thought of Troy standing on my porch and Gerald ringing the bell with his folder of worthless papers. Now I'd see them coming. I could choose whether to answer. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was such a small thing, a camera, an app, but it felt enormous. Wednesday, the donation truck arrived. I stood in the garage watching two men in matching shirts load the 12 boxes into their vehicle. They were cheerful, efficient, unbothered by the volume. One of them asked if I was moving. "No," I said, "just clearing out things I don't need anymore." They drove away and I closed the garage door. The empty space where Gerald's belongings had been looked vast. I had room now for things I actually used, my gardening supplies. The storage containers of decorations I'd accumulated over the years, the boxes of books I'd been meaning to organise. I spent the afternoon rearranging, and by evening the garage no longer felt like a museum of someone else's abandoned hobbies. It was mine, functional, clean. Thursday morning I changed the sheets. I'd been sleeping on the same bedding for years, a floral pattern Gerald had tolerated because I'd bought them on sale. Now I drove to the home goods store downtown and walked through the aisles slowly, touching fabrics, considering colours. I settled on something simple, cream-coloured cotton with a subtle herringbone weave, classic, crisp. At home, I stripped the bed completely. The old sheets went directly into the trash, not the laundry. I didn't want them washed and folded back into my linen closet. I wanted them gone. Making the bed with the new sheets felt ceremonial somehow. I smoothed each corner, tucked the pillowcases just so, arranged the duvet with care. When I stepped back, the bed looked different. It looked like mine. That night I slept better than I had in months. Friday I sat in my living room and noticed the changes, small things mostly. The coffee table was clear of his magazines. The remote control sat exactly where I left it instead of lost between couch cushions. The thermostat was set to a temperature I found comfortable, not the perpetual 68 degrees he'd insisted on to save money while wearing 3 layers. I walked through each room cataloguing. His bathrobe was gone from the bathroom hook. His vitamins were gone from the kitchen counter. The dent his body had worn into the recliner was slowly springing back to its original shape. The house was returning to itself. Or maybe it was becoming itself for the first time, without having to accommodate another presence. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the street. Mrs. Chen from next door walked past with her small white dog. The mailman made his rounds. A delivery truck stopped 3 houses down. Ordinary life continuing in its ordinary patterns. But for me, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Everything felt newly claimed. The chair I sat in was my chair. The window I looked through was my window. The peace that settled over me like afternoon light was mine, earned through small acts of reclamation that had built, brick by brick, into something solid. My phone chimed. A notification from the security app. I opened it and saw the camera view of my front door. No one was there, just a bird landing on the porch railing, triggering the motion sensor. I watched the bird for a moment, small and brown, possibly a sparrow, then dismissed the alert. But I left the app open, feeling the weight of it. This small piece of technology that gave me eyes on my own threshold, that let me choose every single time whether to open the door. Beth arrived Saturday afternoon with a box of pastries from the bakery on 5th Street. The one that made the almond croissants I loved, but rarely bought for myself because they seemed frivolous. "Surprise," she said when I opened the door, and I felt something in my chest loosen at the sight of her, my niece. 43 years old, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked hand-knit, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had her mother's eyes, my sister Grace's eyes, warm and direct in a way that made you feel seen. I hugged her longer than usual. "Come in," I said, and realized it was the first time I'd truly invited someone into the house since Gerald left. Troy didn't count, he'd pushed his way in, but Beth I wanted here. We settled at the kitchen table, the one where I'd sat watching Gerald leave, the one where I'd drunk so many solitary cups of tea. Beth unpacked the croissants and made approving noises about the new locks she'd noticed on the door. "Security upgrade?" she asked. "Something like that." She looked at me then, really looked, and I wondered what she saw. Did I look different? Did the past few weeks show on my face the confrontations, the decisions, the systematic dismantling of a life I'd shared with someone who'd never truly seen me? "You look good," she said finally. "Better than the last time I visited." That had been 6 months ago, when Gerald was still here. He'd monopolised the conversation, talking about a golf tournament he'd placed 3rd in, and Beth had sat politely listening while I'd refilled coffee cups and offered cookies, and generally faded into the background of my own home. "I feel better," I admitted. "Good." She bit into a croissant, then added casually, "Mum mentioned Gerald moved out." "He did. How are you doing with that?" The question was gentle, non-judgmental. She wasn't asking if I was falling apart, or if I regretted it, or if I planned to take him back. She was simply asking how I was. "I'm doing well," I said. And then, because it was Beth and because I was tired of performing, I added, "Actually, I'm doing better than well." "I'm relieved." She nodded slowly. "I always thought he was..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Diminishing. Is that fair to say? Like he made you smaller?" It was exactly fair. Precisely accurate. I felt something prickle behind my eyes. Not tears exactly, but the pressure of being understood. "He did," I said, "for a long time." We talked then, really talked, in a way I hadn't talked to anyone in years. I told her about the separate bank account, the lawyer meeting, the locks and the security cameras. I told her about Troy's visit and Gerald's return with his worthless papers. I told her about packing 12 boxes. and watching them drive away to the donation centre. Beth listened to all of it, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting me speak. And when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, echoing what Sarah the lawyer had said, and I realised how much I'd needed to hear that. Not pity, not concern, pride. "Thank you," I said. "You should write about this," Beth said suddenly, "or record it somehow. Tell your story, because I guarantee you're not the only woman who's gone through something like this, and they need to know they can get out. They need to know it's possible." I hadn't considered that. My reclamation had felt so private, so personal. But Beth was right. There were probably countless women sitting at kitchen tables right now, watching someone diminish them, wondering if it was too late to change course. "Maybe," I said. "Promise me you'll think about it," Beth pressed. "Your voice matters, Aunt Maureen. Your experience matters." We spent another hour together. She told me about her job at the non-profit, about the community garden she'd joined, about her plans to take a pottery class. Ordinary life, but rich with detail and enthusiasm. She wasn't diminished. She'd never let anyone make her smaller. When she left, I stood at the door, my door, with my new locks, and watched her drive away. The afternoon light was fading, turning everything soft and blue. I thought about what she'd said, about my voice mattering, about other women needing to hear that it was never too late. That night, something shifted. I was making dinner, just pasta with olive oil and garlic, nothing elaborate, when I heard the mail slot rattle. I'd forgotten there was an evening delivery on Saturdays sometimes. I wiped my hands and walked to the front hall. An envelope lay on the floor, thick, cream-coloured paper, my name written in Gerald's familiar handwriting, all capitals, slightly cramped. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, front and back, his handwriting filling every available space. I sat down on the stairs and read it. He was sorry, he said. He'd made mistakes. He'd been thoughtless and selfish. He missed me. He missed the house. He missed the life we'd built together. If I'd just give him another chance, he'd do better, be better. He'd respect my boundaries. He'd contribute financially. He'd prove himself worthy of my trust. The words piled up, paragraph after paragraph, and underneath all the apologies, I could sense the real message. He was uncomfortable now. His new situation wasn't working out. He wanted to come back because it was convenient for him. Not because he'd actually changed. At the very end, he wrote, "You're not getting any younger, Maureen. Think about what you're giving up. Think about spending the rest of your life alone. Is your pride really worth that?" I read that last line 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and carried it to the recycling bin in the kitchen. I placed it on top of the old newspapers and junk mail. Then I went back to my pasta, draining it, tossing it with olive oil and garlic and a generous handful of Parmesan cheese. I ate at the kitchen table, slowly, tasting everything. The pasta was perfectly al dente, the garlic was sharp and fragrant. The Parmesan was real, not the powdered kind Gerald had insisted tasted the same. When I finished, I washed my dish and made tea, Earl Grey, the good kind. I sat by the window and watched the last of the daylight fade. The street grew quiet. Mrs. Chen's windows glowed yellow. Somewhere a dog barked twice, then fell silent. My phone sat on the table next to me, and I thought about Beth's words. Tell your story. Your voice matters. Maybe I would. Maybe not now, but someday. Maybe when enough time had passed that I could see the shape of it clearly, this transformation from invisible to visible, from diminished to whole. But tonight, I simply sat in the quiet of my house and let myself feel the weight of what I'd accomplished, the peace I'd chosen, the life I'd reclaimed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation for the ages, no explosive finale, just a woman in her 70s drinking tea by a window, watching evening settle over a street she'd lived on for 43 years. Just me. Whole. Finally. 6 months passed. Not in a blur, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary days that somehow added up to transformation. Mornings making coffee in a kitchen that stayed exactly as I arranged it, afternoons reading without interruption, evenings with the thermostat set to 72 degrees. The house warm enough that I could wear short sleeves instead of layers. The house itself seemed to breathe differently now. The creaks and settling sounds no longer felt like protests, but like contentment. The space expanded somehow, even though the physical dimensions remained the same. Or maybe I expanded. Maybe I'd been compressed for so long that taking up my full allotted volume felt like growth. The tea ritual evolved. I still made it in the mornings, still used my favourite cup white porcelain with a thin gold rim that had survived decades of use without chipping. But now I brought it to the living room and sat in the chair by the window. The one that had been buried under Gerald's newspapers and magazines. I'd reclaimed that chair, positioned it to catch the morning light, and added a small table beside it for my book and reading glasses. That corner was mine. Had always been mine, technically, but now it felt claimed. The legal folder sat in the desk drawer still, but I rarely opened it anymore. Everything was settled, everything was protected. The documents existed as a kind of insurance policy I didn't need to review constantly. And the locks. I barely noticed them now. They'd become simply how the doors worked, not symbols of anything. Though occasionally I'd catch myself running my thumb over the key in my pocket, feeling the unfamiliar ridges and remembering. Beth visited once a month. She'd arrive with pastries or soup or sometimes just herself, and we'd sit at my kitchen table and talk, really talk. She told me about the man she'd started seeing, a teacher at the high school where she volunteered. I told her about the book club I'd joined, meeting every other Tuesday at the library. "You're different," Beth said during her April visit, lighter somehow. I considered that. I think I was carrying a lot that wasn't mine to carry, and now? Now I only carry myself. She smiled at that, and I thought how simple it sounded, how it shouldn't be revolutionary that a 73-year-old woman was only responsible for her own weight. But it felt revolutionary nonetheless. I never saw Gerald again. Sometimes his car would drive past. I'd catch a glimpse of that dented Buick through my window or parked on a cross street, and I'd wonder briefly where he was living, whether he'd found someone else to diminish, whether he ever thought about what he'd lost. But the wondering was abstract, more curiosity than concern. He'd become a character in a story I'd lived rather than an active presence. Troy called once. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail suggesting we talk like adults, and I deleted it without responding. I owed him nothing. His father owed him something, perhaps, but that wasn't my responsibility to solve. The house appreciated in value that spring. I received the assessment in the mail and studied the number with satisfaction. $60,000 more than when I'd bought it. $60,000 that was entirely mine. Secured by all those years of mortgage payments, of maintenance, of stubborn preservation. I sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my kitchen, in my house, and thought about Beth's suggestion from months ago. Tell your story. Your voice matters. So I started writing it down. Not formally, not for publication, just in a spiral notebook I'd bought at the drugstore, blue cover with white stars. I wrote in the evenings, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just a few sentences. I wrote about the grocery store incident, about Troy's visit, about the locks and the lawyer and the 12 boxes I'd donated. I wrote about the silence that had once pressed on my ribs, but that now felt like space to breathe. And I wrote this, which maybe you're reading now, whoever you are. Maybe you're sitting at your own kitchen table, drinking your own tea, wondering if it's too late to reclaim yourself. Wondering if the peace you see other women carrying is something you're still allowed to reach for. Let me tell you something I learned at 73. It's not too late. Your silence isn't kindness. Your accommodation isn't love. Your gradual disappearance isn't sacrifice worth celebrating. You are not a function. You are not a service. You are not a placeholder in someone else's life. And when you finally say no, when you finally close the door and change the locks and sit in the quiet of your own space, you might be alone, that's true. But you'll be alone in a way that's different from how you were alone before. You'll be alone with yourself. And if you've spent decades abandoning yourself to accommodate someone else, that reunion might be the most important one of your life. I didn't just survive Gerald leaving. I rebuilt. I reclaimed. I remembered who I'd been before I learned to make myself smaller. And now, sitting here in my living room As spring light filters through windows I chose the curtains for, drinking tea from my favourite cup, I can tell you this with absolute certainty: I won. Not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, not through revenge or public humiliation. I won by refusing to disappear, by insisting quietly and persistently that I mattered, that my name on the deed meant something, that my years of building this life earned me the right to live it on my terms. The house is quiet now, profoundly quiet, but it's not the hollow quiet of loss. It's the full quiet of peace.